If I was given the task of building a login system, what stack would I be using? From the front end all the way to the back end. That is what I'm going to be talking about in today's video. Now, this question comes off of the back of Web Developers Working Week episode 5. That is a series about what I get up to as a freelance web developer. And this question was asked by Rich Williams. It's a very interesting question. It's a very broad question as well, because there really isn't a right or wrong answer to it. But I'm going to give you my opinion of what the tools I would use to create a login application from the front end all the way to the back end. Now, this question doesn't have any boundaries as to what kind of system it is. It's just a login application. So there's no idea as to what kind of application this is doing, what the project is trying to achieve. So this isn't a clear-cut sort of, this is what you should do if you need to have a login authentication system. This is what I've perhaps done in the past, what I would probably do based on some of the assumptions that I'm making. Now, there's a couple of areas that we need to talk about here. One is the front end, one is the back end, one is how this data is to be stored. And the front end, I guess, might have some JavaScript running on it. The back end may have PHP. It could even have Python running on it. And the data store, I'm assuming, could be a database like MySQL. It could even be a MongoDB. However, because it's a login system, I'm just going to discount NoSQL. And the reason why I'm discounting NoSQL here is because NoSQL, in my opinion, isn't a very good way of having user authentication. Perhaps some parts of the other bits of the system uses a NoSQL, but for me personally, I like to have structured data when users log in. So, for example, I want to have a well-defined schema that dictates how the user credentials are stored and how the user is mapped to perhaps their profiles. The profiles themselves might be stored on Mongo, but the actual password, the actual username, the email address, I would prefer it to be in a SQL type data store. And why do I say that? Well, with all of these document NoSQL storage engines, it's very easy to override things or overwrite things. Plus, you certainly wouldn't want to have the password and the user credentials coming back down with the document that you've got. Also, I think it's a very good thing to separate the user credentials from the rest of the system. It's very useful to separate the two systems. I do a lot of stuff with different subsystems, if you will, almost like microservices. And so we have perhaps a specific database, data storage engine for different parts of the system. And therefore, nothing gets interfered or infected. And if one thing becomes hacked, then that is just one thing that becomes hacked. So because this requirement is just to do a login application, I am going to specifically use MySQL for it. However, you could use MariaDB, or you could just use SQL, or you could use Oracle, or what have you. But for me, MySQL is my go-to for that kind of thing. Now, I guess if someone was to put me in a pigeonhole, if someone was to put me in a category or add a label onto me, then perhaps I would be given the title of a full stack developer. However, I really don't particularly like that title. I won't get into that in this video. So I do a lot of stuff for both the front end and the back end and the database as well. Sometimes I even have the opportunity of designing the whole system, including perhaps mobile applications that latch on to the back end and so forth, whatever. So I'm going to tackle this from both the front end and the back end. I've already tackled the database. So again, I go back to the whole point of just not knowing really where the boundaries are with what this application is doing. So I would be taking a very minimalistic approach to this. So I would be obviously having HTML5 forms, right, which you can just create in HTML, only a few lines of HTML if it is just a login system. I certainly wouldn't be using any kind of JavaScript framework just for a login page, right? That to me is completely unnecessary overkill. It depends, however, what else this system is doing, but a login form is just simply a post request. Well, it's a post request and a get request. You're doing a get request to get the form, and you're doing a post request to send the form up. And then you return a response based on, whether or not the credentials are correct. So I don't think that warrants any kind of crazy framework in JavaScript, to be honest. It's just a simple, well, to be fair, it's just two text boxes and a button. So why would anybody have JavaScript that would do that? Again, I don't know what the other boundaries are for the other bits of the system. So there might be other interesting things that this system needs to do, these features have to do, but because that wasn't mentioned in the question, I can't make those assumptions. And it's very dangerous as a software developer to make assumptions where you are overcomplicating the application. Okay, so you want to be quite minimal as much as you can. And we're going to talk about minimalism a little bit more when I talk about the back end. So let's go ahead and talk about what programming language I would use in the back end. And I'll give you a hint. So I would use PHP. And why would I use PHP? Well, it's because that most of the servers these days come with the ability to install PHP extremely easily with things like Apache and Nginx. However, I'm a Docker guy, so I quite like Docker. So if I was to develop this locally, I would probably be creating myself a Docker image for this. However, that doesn't mean that it needs to be in Docker when it's in production. Certainly not. And you might be seeing that as just more overcomplications when you've got it in Docker. But for me, I like to separate my local projects that I have running locally in Docker machines. I would also consider Python. However, I probably would consider PHP over Python simply because of the other things that this application may be doing. So even though I said that you shouldn't be making assumptions, you should be laying down some architectural foundations for what could be coming up later on. And with PHP, there is an awful lot of ease of use with that, with other things, with other features. I guess you could say that's the same with Python as well, but it's just my experience, and this might be something just in the UK here, but there's a lot of PHP shops around, there's a lot of PHP talent around, and there is a lot of need for PHP. So why would I do it in Python? And my mentality is that just because the login section is written in PHP doesn't mean that everything else needs to be written in PHP later on down the line. And that is because I have a kind of a microservice mentality with it. It means that you can build little services in different languages that are more relevant to the feature that you're dealing with. So, for example, you might have a microservice that just does the user authentication, user registration, and perhaps the user profile bits and pieces. And that would be perhaps done in PHP. However, saying that there isn't any features right now, you might be thinking that that is overcomplicating it a bit, which is fair enough. But this really doesn't need to have microservices right now. Essentially, this is only one service, and that is a login service. But I'm just thinking of what might be coming up in the future. So we've decided on either PHP or Python as a way of accessing the data from the database and sending back a response to the front end. And I said that I wouldn't be using a framework for the front end, but I would probably be using a framework for the back end. Why? Well, the back end is where I think all the heavy lifting will be, right? For a start, it's doing the authentication. You wouldn't be doing any authentication at the front end because it's the front end, because it's easy to manipulate maliciously. It's JavaScript. you can read it. It's, you would do that in the server, and then you would return an encoded token, or you would return an access denied error, that kind of thing, through the backend. The backend is where the cogs of this machine will be, right? So I'm going to use a framework. However, because I don't know what kind of other features this application uses, I'm not going to use a very massive framework. I'm not going to suddenly use Django for Python. I'm not suddenly going to use Zend in PHP. I would probably stick to something very minimalist, something that I could change and adapt later on. So with PHP, I would probably use either Slim PHP or Lumen. So Slim PHP is a micro framework. Same with Lumen. Lumen is based off of Laravel. Both very good, easy to work with frameworks, and like I said, they are minimal, right? So that there's no crazy libraries in those things. We're not building Zend, we're not using Symfony, we're not using any kind of other crazy Concrete 5 type applications or CMSs, because I don't know yet what this system needs to achieve, and therefore my choices right away are not going to be dictated by any crazy assumptions that I make. However, I still want to build a foundation that allows for other components to be easily slotted in. I don't want my decisions right now to dictate the complexity levels of where this application will be later down the line. And of course, if I was using Python, then I would probably use Flask, because again, Flask is a very lightweight micro framework that you can quickly use and quickly spin up, and you can quickly add other components to it as well. So with Flask, I would probably use SQL Alchemy to connect to the database. With Slim PHP and Lumen, I might use Doctrine ORM, that kind of thing as well. And regardless of whether it's PHP or Python, I would use a library that would help me out with the OAuth 2 authentication and authorization of the user credentials. It's important when you are thinking about what languages, what libraries, and what frameworks to use when you have a decision to make like this, that you are as minimal as possible. You try and come up with a simple solution. The simpler, the better. The fewer the libraries, the less overhead. The fewer the frameworks, the less overhead. The less challenges in deployment and testing and so on and so forth. You can tell probably that I'm getting ready for my talk at PHP Southwest regarding software complexities. But right now, where I've only been given the remit of build a login system from front to back, it's important to be very minimal, because you don't know what's coming up down the line. You don't know what features are going to be asked of. And so any choices that you make right now, you do not want to be stuck in a rut later on. You don't want to be thinking, God, I wish I never made that choice. I wish we never installed this third-party application, this third-party library. I wish we weren't using this framework, because it's very challenging to adapt that to the new requirements coming through. So in summary, on the front end, I wouldn't be using any JavaScript framework, and probably I wouldn't be even using JavaScript at all, because this is just a simple login functionality, right? There's no need to have JavaScript here. I would just simply be using HTML5. For the data storage, I would be using SQL, MySQL, or MariaDB, or something like that. Something that is a relational data storage engine, okay? And for the backend, I would be either using Slim PHP, or I would be using Lumen, or I would be using Flask for Python. Now, what I've essentially done is I've set myself up to be extendable later on with low maintenance overhead. So with Slim PHP, or Lumen, or Flask, it's very easy to create APIs. And this is kind of where my head would be going, because without knowing what the other functionality is, it might be that this requires perhaps an API later on. And it's very easy to make APIs with these frameworks, with these micro frameworks. If it doesn't need an API, then we can still use these frameworks on the back end as a way of sending down relative responses to the front end. It doesn't have to be an API, of course. It just allows you to create an API if needed. I'll be interested to hear what you guys think. If you disagree with me, if you do agree with me, let me know. Put your thoughts down in the doobly-doo below. Let's have a conversation and a discussion on what you would use in this circumstance. If you haven't done so already, please do subscribe. On Tuesday, we have a programming tutorial. On Wednesday, I talk about what I get up to as a freelance web and mobile applications developer. And on Friday, we have a discussion like this. Thanks ever so much for watching. Happy coding, everyone. Have a good week, and I'll see you again soon. Cheers. Bye.